Chapter 8. Davis searched the crowd and finally spotted Cora. A huge grin covered his face as he drank in the sight of her. She wore a caramel-colored sweater and a turquoise scarf. He raised his hand and she waved in return and started making her way through the crowd to him. "Hello," he said, dropping his bag and holding out his arms. As soon as his arms came around her, he felt his world right itself back to the way it belonged. "Hello yourself," she said in his ear. He put his hands on her shoulders and kissed her enthusiastically, feeling the world around them slip away. As they broke their embrace, he picked up the bag at his feet and she hooked her arm through his. "I am so excited you were able to come," she said, hugging her body against his arm as they walked. "I know you're missing Thanksgiving with your family." "You are too," she shrugged. "Well, only because Chase is playing. Thanksgiving for us has never really been turkey at a table. It's been more like finding the best local restaurant to eat dinner. If we weren't following my parents' football team to a game, we've been following Chase." He looked over at her as she turned her head and grinned at him. "Works out for me. I'll never have to worry about juggling holidays whenever I get married." "Well, that is certainly a plus." For months, they had communicated via video chat and their social media excursions. Through all the training he'd done since she left the morning of July 5th, he'd felt her lack of presence like a physical thing. It surprised him how much he wanted her by his side, and how he felt centered in his soul with her presence. To think that she would accompany him to Korea made him feel like he could take the gold for the USA all on his own. About 90 minutes later, they pulled into the driveway of her Cape Cod cottage. He had a reservation for his own beach house, the same one he'd stayed at this summer, but for now they would enjoy Thanksgiving together. She handed him the keys. "You can use the car when you leave tonight." He slipped the keys into his jeans pocket and left his bag in the car, following her up the porch. As they entered the house, he could smell cinnamon in the air and the savory aroma of roasting poultry. His mouth immediately started watering. "It smells good in here," he said, following her into the kitchen. A pumpkin pie sat on a cooling rack on the counter next to 2 raw sweet potatoes. Cora walked over to a slow cooker and lifted the lid as steam poured out of the bowl. "Looks nearly done." She checked the digital thermometer attached to the probe sticking out of the bird. "Almost. Great timing." She looked up at him and smiled. "Good thing your flight wasn't delayed." "Definitely." He gestured toward the counter. "What can I do?" She opened the fridge and took out a bunch of asparagus grouped together with a rubber band. "You can wash these." From a cupboard below the counter, she pulled out a baking sheet. "Spread them out on this." They'd cooked together several times the week they spent together this summer. She always willingly accepted his offer of help, and never acted like he couldn't handle any kitchen task. While he turned the water on in the sink, she went to the fridge again and took out a square glass baking dish covered in foil. "I'll get the dressing in the oven and start on the gravy." Several hours later, they sat on the back porch swing. Cora lay snuggled up against him under a wool blanket in plaid colors that made him think of the New England Patriots. The fire in the fire pit danced against the darkening sky. "It's so surreal to have you here." "It's right to be here." He closed his eyes and leaned his cheek against her hair, breathing in the scent of her shampoo. He felt it seep into his lungs. "It's been as hard as I thought it would be, but I feel so much less exhausted right now than I did when I woke up this morning. I'm just happy they gave you the weekend off." "It's good for morale." He brushed his lips against her forehead. "We've all worked extremely hard. Time for a break." He patted his stomach. "And pie. Time for pie." She poked his stomach with her index finger. "How did you fit a pie under that six-pack?" He laughed and felt his face heat. "Was I that soft before?" "I have no idea. I've not had a lot of opportunity to punch you in the stomach." She straightened and pulled her phone out of her sweatshirt pocket. "Let's do this before the light is completely gone." Davis looked at the phone screen and saw her face lit up with a huge smile, reflecting pure joy. He couldn't help but smile back as she snapped a picture. He watched her type the caption. "So, #blessed and #thankful this year. God's love. Davis here for a brief visit. And pie. #Team USA. #going for the gold. #God is good." She sent it, and he hugged her tightly to him. "No hottie?" "You're a total hottie, but I think I've used it enough." A bark of laughter escaped him. "Yeah, no doubt." With great regret, he pulled away from her. "I need to go." She straightened and pushed the blanket off, but stuck her lower lip out. "I wish you didn't have to." Reaching over to cuff her cheek, he looked deep into her green eyes, feeling temptation he knew he must battle. "Cora, you have no idea how much I wish I didn't have to either." He leaned forward and gently kissed her. When he pulled away, he kept his hand on her cheek. "See you tomorrow." It physically hurt to straighten up and walk away from her, to pull the keys out of his pocket and walk around the house to the front. When he started the car and began to back out of the driveway, he looked up and saw her at the front door, her hand raised in a wave. Cora rushed through the crowd at baggage claim and launched herself at Davis's arms. He lifted her off the ground and swung her around. "I can't believe I'm here," she said seconds before his lips covered hers. She felt like he still swung her around, while the world spun around them as he kissed her and kissed her. By the time she stepped away, her knees felt weak and her hands trembled. "Well," she said, grinning, holding her fingertips to her lips, "that was worth the last month of separation." He put a hand on the small of her back and led her through the airport. "I'd kiss you like that every day if I could. I think I'd let you." She held the handle of her suitcase and pulled it behind her. "How are things?" "Gearing up. Russia's ban from the Olympics really spurred our practices in an insane way. Suddenly, the gold looks promising." He held her hand as they stepped out of the airport. The warmth in the Tampa air surprised her, though it shouldn't have. Tampa and the Gulf Coast of Central Florida didn't feel oppressively hot, but it certainly wasn't cold either. Davis gestured toward the cab stand. As they slid into the back of a cab, he spoke to the driver. "The Viscoli Hotel, please. The downtown, not the Bay location." "You got it," said the driver with a faint Spanish accent. He pulled his phone out of his pocket and held it up. "Ready?" "Sure." She put her arms around his neck and hugged him to her. She could smell his aftershave and a cinnamon breath mint. It felt so good to touch his skin against hers. The face reflecting back at her from the phone screen looked like someone in utter bliss. She watched him write the caption. "Missed this lady. My Christmas is now the merriest and brightest. God bless." "What's your following like now?" "Once they announced the official roster for the games, I topped 1 million. A lot of my followers are from Canada, which is kind of strange, but I guess they just like hockey no matter who's playing. Anyway, everything about you still goes crazy." "This is a good thing," she said with a smile. "It's what's paying for your next semester of school, right?" "And then some." She settled as close to him as she could and felt his arm come across her shoulders. Looking out the window of the cab, she watched the scenery pass by and hooked her fingers with his. "This is right," she said softly. He kissed the top of her head. "Your parents are cool?" "Mostly." She closed her eyes and felt her body sway with the car. "I think they understand. They're making their way to the Keys right now to be with my mom's whole family. I think it's hard, though. The first time a child isn't with you at Christmas. I remember when my foster sisters were gone. I was only 4, but they'd been there my whole life. It felt wrong and empty." "Empty nest." His arm tightened in a squeeze. "My parents are allowing it with the understanding that one day I'll bring my grandchildren home for Christmas to liven things up a bit." "Your folks are up in Michigan, right?" "That's where Dad is going to retire. He has a lot of family in the area. Got a place on the peninsula not too far from Sawyer Air Force Base. Dad hits the PX and commissary pretty often when they go up there. Lots of public land and good hunting, close to either lake. But right now they're in Georgia." "What's Christmas like? In Michigan, I mean," she asked. Cora had spent nearly all her Christmas to New Year's weeks in the Florida Keys. He shrugged. "Probably about as cold as Boston. It's pretty cold up there in December." Cora shook her head to get a stray hair out of her line of sight, then snuggled back onto his shoulder. She glanced at the buildings outside as they cruised toward downtown Tampa. "I've only spent one Christmas in Boston. It was cold, though." She had a sudden vision of walking with him into her parents' house, little black-haired children running in front of them. It excited her to think that. She turned her head and grinned up at him. "They're still coming to celebrate the New Year with you, right?" "That's right. On their way to Korea." As the cab approached the hotel, Cora straightened and put a hand on her hair, making sure all disheveled strands from snuggling with him fell back into place. Davis swiped his card in the cab's card reader as Cora got out of the car and supervised the valet removing her suitcase from the trunk. She followed him to his valet stand. "What's the name?" "Cora Anderson." She paused. At a Viscoli hotel, that name meant something. As expected, his head whipped up and his eyes widened as he looked at her. "Yes, Miss Anderson, of course." He waved to a uniformed hop inside the door. She recognized the subtle hand signal that indicated VIP. The hop immediately jogged toward them. "Miss Anderson's bags to the penthouse, please." Cora smiled. "Thank you." As she turned, Davis approached. Her heart skipped a beat at the sight of him in jeans and a dark blue golf shirt with one of his sponsor's logos embroidered on the chest. His black hair shone in the sunlight, and he had a smile in his eyes. "All set?" "Yes." She slipped her hand into his and walked into the hotel. Davis looked around and gestured at a hallway. "Let's see if there's a seating area that way." Unlike the New York Viscoli Hotel, the lobby of the Viscoli Tampa downtown had a cool tropical feel to it. The floors were white and cream alabaster quartz with touches of teak and mahogany trim. Glass walls looked out onto a garden dotted with live palm trees, and quiet fountains ran to artificial creeks and waterfalls that fed koi ponds. Brass guardrails flanked short wooden bridges that connected cozy nooks, some boutique shops, and restaurants. She followed him, and they found a secluded pair of sofas around a small table nestled near a white enamel grand piano. She sat on the couch and turned her body toward him so she could look at him while they talked and draped her arm over the back of the couch. "You're sure you don't want to come up to the room? It probably has 2 or 3 bedrooms. I imagine it's bigger than my place at the Cape." Davis put his hand on top of hers. "It's less about the size of the suite and more about our reputations." He cleared his throat. "I'd rather not hurt our witness if anyone saw us coming and going out of a hotel room." "Fair enough." She sighed and put her other hand on his knee. "It's good to be here. Tell me about it." 7 days a week, we're on the ice or in the gym. The focus is incredible. I have few words to explain how awesome this experience is. He put his arm across the couch like her and laced his fingers with hers. "I almost feel like the beginning of the games will mark the end of something I don't necessarily want to end." She thought about the week after she came home from Rio and how lost and hazy she felt, like all her focus had left the world. It took a lot of prayer and meditation to reset. "I can see that. I filled sketchbooks with Bible verses as I worked through the games being over and my life having to reset. It was something I didn't expect." They had an opportunity to speak briefly only a couple of times a week, but they only had a few minutes at a time between schedules and a need for sleep. It felt so good to be sitting here, facing him, knowing they had 3 full days of uninterrupted time. She was thankful that Christmas fell on a Monday, which gave him a long weekend. "How are your finals?" "Maddening. Tell me again why I'm going for a law degree?" He laughed. "Something about you keeping agents from taking advantage of desperate players in various sports? I can't remember the specific rant at the time. I have my own theories." "Oh? What's that, mister?" "I think you want your Juris Doctorate to make your father proud of you." "Maybe. Is that so wrong?" Davis shook his head. "There's nothing at all wrong with honoring your mother and father." She smiled. "I just know that I feel like my head is going to explode with school. I'm so over it right now." "Chewed up and spit out, huh?" "Something like that." She grinned. "But I'm here now." Her stomach growled. "And starving. Let's see what kind of restaurants Uncle Tony has in this resort." "Okay." His hand tightened on her laced fingers as he pulled her forward. "I have something to do first." Laughing, she nearly landed in his lap, but had no problem wrapping her arms around his neck to steady herself as he brought his mouth to hers. Davis looked at Cora's face illuminated by the candlelight. She wore a bright green dress with long, sheer sleeves. The color made her eyes glow. When she smiled, his heart soared. When she laughed, it sounded like music to his ears. He thought he could look at her face for the rest of his life and never get tired of seeing it. With abnormal nerves, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small jewelry box wrapped in bright green paper. He set it on the table and slid it toward her. "Merry Christmas, Cora," he said softly. She gasped and took the little box, quickly discarding the paper. When she lifted the lid, she looked at him. "Oh, Davis!" She took the necklace out of the box and held it up. A volleyball carved out of jade lay nestled in a silver setting that shone in the candlelight. "This is beautiful." "Hardly compared to you," he said. He got out of his chair and walked around the table to help her put it on, thankful she'd kept her neck bare tonight. After he fastened the chain, he kissed the side of her neck and went back to his seat. She traced the lines of the ball with 2 fingers, tears shimmering in her eyes. "I love it so much." "That's wonderful," he said, fiddling with the handle of his coffee cup. "I bought it weeks ago. I couldn't wait to give it to you." She took a sip of her water. "I wish I didn't have to leave tomorrow." The fact that she wanted to stay with him pleased him and concerned him. "I know. But staying here wouldn't mean anything. I go back to training tomorrow. True. Back to lockdown and curfews. She put her elbow on the table and her chin in her hand. I cannot wait to see you walk into the opening ceremonies. I think you'll be able to hear me above the crowd. In all his years playing hockey, he'd never had a special someone to cheer for him in the stands. The thought of Cora's presence gave him an excited, nervous feeling. I bet I will. She reached under the table, lifted a large, flat box wrapped in white paper covered in candy canes out from under it, and held it out to him. Merry Christmas Eve, Davis. Curious, he took the box from her, feeling the weight, wondering what it might contain. Inside, he found a framed Boston Bruins black and gold jersey, number 7. His mouth went dry, and he looked at her, eyes wide. What? She clapped her hands in excitement. Look! He signed it! Inside the number 7, he could see the signature of Phil Esposito, a legend in hockey from long before he was born, and member of the Hockey Hall of Fame. How? My dad knows a guy. She stood and walked around the table, tracing the frame with her finger. I was really hoping you'd like it. It's incredible. He felt overwhelmed, and the rational part of his brain took over. He thought about logistics. I don't know where I can put it right now to keep it safe. Oh, don't worry. I can take it home with me. She put an arm over his shoulder and warmly kissed his cheek. I think you'll know where to find it. He grinned and pushed away from the table, standing with her. In her heels, she towered over him. Trying to make sure I come back to you, huh? Her smile warmed him. Something like that. I'm okay with it. He gestured at the entrance. Ready? Yes. What time does the service start? 7. They walked, hand in hand, through the hotel lobby. Davis wore a black suit with a silver tie covered in green and white candy canes, but he knew that the looks from the people in the lobby had everything to do with the stunning Cora by his side. She looked and moved like a supermodel and stood out because of her height and the dress she wore. Most people probably glanced, recognized her, and tried to figure out why. Get us a cab, and I'll run this up to my room, Cora said, holding up his framed jersey. A short cab ride later, they entered the church together, each of them taking a white taper candle sitting inside a little paper circle from one of the ushers. They entered the dimly lit sanctuary and found seats near the back. No one spoke, and the silence filled the room with reverence and awe. A giant Christmas tree reached the ceiling of the church, and red bows and pine garland decorated the front. The choir director approached the podium, and musicians quietly began playing O Holy Night. As the words appeared on the screen, Davis put his hand on Cora's waist and lifted his voice in praise. They sang hymns, prayed, and listened to a very brief message. The pastor lit the large central candle, then several ushers walked forward holding candles. The pastor lit each candle and dispatched the ushers to use their candles to light the wicks of the people on the edges of the pews, who then used their flames to light the candles of the people next to them. Soon, the entire church was filled with the light of several hundred candles. The pastor encouraged everyone to stay as long as they wanted and to spend time in prayer. Sometime later, Cora and Davis left, gently setting their candles inside the box next to the exit. That was so beautiful, Cora said, slipping her hand into his. It was. I needed that. I think I did too. When they got back to the hotel, Davis led her back to the corner sitting area near the grand piano. Tomorrow she'd leave, and the next time he would see her would be on Korean soil. Tonight, though, he had all the time in the world to tell her goodbye.